The stars are right, and that means it's time for another episode of The Whisper in Darkness. I'm your host, the man from Leng. Thank you very much for joining me today. On this episode, I am kicking off my reviews of the Circle Undone, the 4th Deluxe expansion for the Arkham Horror LCG, with a look at the Guardian cards in the box. There are 4 Guardian cards in this expansion, however, I am reviewing the cards with the tarot traits separately, so this review will deal with the other 3 cards. There are spoilers throughout if you care about that sort of thing. If you enjoy what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Let's get started. The first Guardian card in the box is Interrogate. It's a 2-cost event with combat and intellect skill icons and the tactic and insight traits. It has the game text Parlay. Choose a humanoid enemy at your location and test Combat 3. This test gets plus X difficulty, where X is the chosen enemy's damage value. If you succeed, discover 1 clue at your location and 1 clue at any other location. Interrogate gives players a chance to play good cop, bad cop with the enemies. Judging by the card's art and its mechanics, you are definitely the bad cop in this scenario, threatening to beat the tar out of a suspect unless they cooperate. Interrogate is the second player card with the Parlay action that has been released, the first being Persuasion, a Seeker event from the Threads of Fate Mythos pack. Persuasion has a very similar templating, except that you need to pass an intellect skill test of variable difficulty, and if you succeed, you get to shuffle the chosen enemy into the encounter deck. Interrogate seems like a decent card at first glance. If you pass the Combat 3 skill test on Interrogate, you may discover up to 2 clues, 1 at your location and 1 at any other location in play. That's pretty good for a level 0 card that doesn't provoke an attack of opportunity. You don't even need to be engaged with the enemy that you parlay when you play this card. That said, there are several conditions you need to fulfill if you want those clues. First, you need a humanoid enemy at your location. Humanoid enemies appear in quite a few scenarios, although there are notable exceptions, such as the Miskatonic Museum. If humanoid enemies appear in the scenario, there's no guarantee that you'll draw one from the encounter deck, in which case Interrogate becomes skill test fodder. This is a bigger problem in solo than multiplayer, where you see a lot more encounter cards over the course of the game and hence a lot more enemies. You can improve the odds of drawing a humanoid in either solo or multiplayer by playing on the Hunt, a Guardian event from Black Star's Rise, which lets you search the top 9 cards of the encounter deck for an enemy and draw it. Second, you need at least 2 locations in play with clues on them to get the most out of Interrogate. Again, I think this is a bigger problem in solo than it is in multiplayer, especially if the scenario is more linear or you approach scenarios that way. The Essex County Express is a great example of a linear scenario in which Interrogate is going to be skill test fodder. There's only one way to go in that scenario, and you can't leave clues behind to discover later. However, if I'm soloing open-ended scenarios such as the Midnight Masks or Blood on the Altar, I still tend to approach them in a linear fashion. I prefer to discover all the clues at location A before discovering all the clues at location B, before discovering all the clues at location C, and so on, so I don't waste precious time backtracking. Interrogate doesn't lend itself to that sort of playstyle. If you're soloing an open-ended scenario such as the Midnight Masks, I suppose you could reveal a bunch of locations before getting down to business of discovering clues. But then you're pinning your hopes on drawing a humanoid enemy at the right time. I wouldn't be too worried about that in either the Midnight Masks or Blood on the Altar, since humanoid enemies are fairly common in both of those scenarios. But that strategy seems riskier to me than just dealing with each scenario in turn, so you don't need to backtrack. Again, this is the solo player in me talking. If you're playing multiplayer, you're likely to have more revealed locations in play because investigators tend to spread out a lot more in that format. The other trick, of course, is passing that combat skill test, which isn't a slam dunk for most Guardian and off-class Guardians. Of the 68 humanoid enemies in the game, the overwhelming majority deal damage, so you'll likely need to pass a Combat 4 skill test, or in rare cases, a Combat 5 skill test, if you want those clues. With the notable exception of Carolyn Fern, most Guardians have a combat skill values of 4 or 5. Of the off-class Guardians, Skids O'Toole and Diana Stanley have a combat skill values of 3, while William York and Joe Diamond have combat skill values of 4. If you're playing on standard difficulty and you're aiming to be 2 up before the pull, most investigators will need to pump their combat skill values to pass the skill test consistently. Even Mark Harrigan, who is the most intimidating investigator of the bunch with a combat skill value of 5, will likely need a little bit of help encouraging enemies to spill the beans about their nefarious plans. Interrogate has the Insight trait, which means Joe Diamond can play it for free if you include it in his hunch deck at the beginning of a scenario. I haven't played Joe Diamond all that much yet, but I have given some thought to the contents of his hunch deck. For those of you who are unfamiliar with how Joe's hunch deck works, you set aside 11 cards with the Insight trait at the beginning of the scenario. One of those cards must be Joe's weakness, unsolved case. When the investigation phase begins, you reveal the top card of the hunch deck, and Joe may play that card at -2 resource cost. If you don't play the card by the end of the investigation phase, you shuffle it back into the hunch deck. So basically, Joe has the option to play one card randomly revealed from his hunch deck each turn. I've been trying to decide whether it's better to include cards such as Interrogate in Joe's hunch deck, since Joe may play it for free that way, or in Joe's draw deck, since the card is somewhat conditional and timing is important. I've been leaning toward the latter, at least in solo, because Interrogate is a lot more sensitive to timing than cards such as No Stone Unturned and Preposterous Sketches. But I don't think I'll know for sure which is the best way to go until I've had a chance to test it further. Interrogate has a powerful effect if you can pull it off, but it also has a significant number of conditions that you need to fulfill, which is never a good thing. Interrogate could see play in toolbox-style Guardian or off-class Guardian builds that want to mix combat and discovering clues. I think Interrogate lends itself to multiplayer because it's easier to fulfill the card's conditions in that format. That said, you can play around those conditions in solo with a little forethought, so I certainly wouldn't write it off in that format. The card may find a home in Joe Diamond's hunch deck, since Joe can play it for free if it is revealed at the beginning of the investigation phase. The random nature of the hunch deck, though, makes me wonder whether Interrogate might be better in his draw deck, so you have greater control over the timing. But again, that will take some testing to figure out what goes in that hunch deck. The second card in the box is Delay the Inevitable. It's a 2-cost event with combat and agility skill icons and the insight, spirit, and tactic traits. It has the game text fast, play only during your turn, attached to an investigator at your location under his or her control. Response: when you are dealt damage and or horror, discard Delay the Inevitable and cancel all damage and or horror just dealt. Forced: when the Mythos phase ends, you must either spend 2 resources or discard Delay the Inevitable. Guardians have 3 options to deal with damage and or horror. They may cancel it altogether with cards such as Dodge from the core set, and I've had worse, from Where Doom Awaits. They may soak it with allies and other assets such as True Grit from the Path to Carcosa. Finally, they may also heal it using cards such as First Aid from the core set, Emergency Aid from the Miskatonic Museum, If It Bleeds from Undimensioned and Unseen, Second Wind from the Boundary Beyond, or Kerosene from Shattered Aeons. Delay the Inevitable falls into the first category, damage and or horror cancellation. It's slightly more expensive than Dodge at 2 resources, but it's also slightly more versatile since it may cancel damage and or horror dealt to an investigator during any phase of the game from sources other than enemies. Unlike Dodge, Delay the Inevitable is also an attachment that will remain in play until you need it, as long as you're willing to spend the resources to keep it around. At worst, Delay the Inevitable is a slightly more expensive Dodge, and at its best it will prevent you from taking 3 horror from a Rotting Remains, or 10 damage from Beyond the Veil. I certainly like the sound of that. Delay the Inevitable has the Insight trait, which makes it a contender for Joe Diamond's hunch deck. Joe can play Delay the Inevitable for free if it is revealed, which is fantastic. Between Delay the Inevitable, Dodge, and Emergency Aid, which Joe may also play for free from his Hunch deck, Joe has a significant amount of damage prevention and healing at his fingertips, and I haven't even discussed any of the other healing cards available to him in the Guardian and Seeker classes. It's also worth noting that Delay the Inevitable can go in a Diana Stanley deck, and if you do use it to cancel or ignore damage and horror, you do get to place it under her to give her that willpower boost. So that's awfully nice as well. Delay the Inevitable has the Spirit trait which means it's fair game for Calvin Wright. This card is a real boon to Calvin, who needs to take damage and horror to be effective, but not so much damage or horror that he is defeated. Delay the Inevitable gives Calvin another tool to fall back on in the event he gets overwhelmed or surprised. Delay the Inevitable is non-unique, so you can have two of them attached to Calvin, although that will likely put too great a strain on his resources. There's a lot to like about Delay the Inevitable. I think it's going to find a home primarily in Joe Diamond, who can play it for free, and Calvin Wright, who needs all the damage and or horror prevention that he can get his hands on. You can also play it in Diana Stanley, of course, and place it beneath her if you do use it to cancel damage or horror. I can also see it making the cut in combat-oriented Guardians who may prefer it over Dodge, because it can help them weather the Mythos phase, which is something Dodge cannot do. Who knows, they may even play it as a third or fourth copy of Dodge, making themselves very resilient against enemies and the encounter deck. The more damage and or horror you can cancel is the less damage and or horror you need to soak or heal, which makes Delay the Inevitable a very attractive option. The next Guardian card in the box is Steadfast. It's a skill with willpower and combat skill icons and the innate trait. It has the game text, while you have 5 or more total remaining health and sanity, Steadfast gains 1 willpower and 1 combat skill icon. While you have 10 or more total remaining health and sanity, Steadfast gains 2 willpower and 2 combat skill icons instead. The Circle Undone includes a set of skill cards that gain skill icons if an investigator meets or exceeds a certain threshold. Steadfast is the Guardian skill in the group. The others are Curiosity, Cunning, Prophecy, and Able-Bodied. I'm always a little worried about this approach to card design. Done well, it can produce a powerful set of cards that see a lot of play, a la the permanent talents released in Blood on the Altar. Unfortunately, if the design misses the mark, you also run the risk of releasing a bunch of cards all at once that are either too weak or too narrow to see much play, a la the Composure talents released in Echoes of the Past. Steadfast is like a Guts and an Overpower rolled into one. You may commit only 1 copy of Guts or Overpower to a skill test, and if that skill test is successful, you draw a card, effectively replacing the skill card you just committed to the test. Steadfast takes a different approach, dropping the restriction and the card draw in favor of adding a bunch of skill icons. Steadfast has 1 of each skill icon, 2 of each while you have 5 or more total remaining health and sanity. While you have 10 or more total remaining health and sanity, Steadfast has 3 of each, which is pretty awesome. Most of the Guardians and off-class Guardians who can play Steadfast start a scenario with a 14 total health and sanity. The 2 exceptions are Carolyn Fern and Zoe Samaras, who start a scenario with 15. Remember that Steadfast does have the innate trait, so Silas Marsh can play it as well. For the majority of investigators, Steadfast will have 3 of each skill icon until you have taken a total of 5 damage and or horror, at which point it will only have 2 of each. If you're on the verge of defeat, Steadfast will only have 1 of each skill icon. Personally, I would prefer that Steadfast to have 3 willpower or combat skill icons toward the end of a scenario rather than at the beginning. Because if you're on the verge of defeat, skill tests tend to become do-or-die affairs, and those skill icons become slightly more valuable. But that's just me. My only qualm with Steadfast and the other skills with this template and it's a relatively minor one, is that there are times when that third skill icon is less valuable than the first two due to diminishing returns. That's especially true on easy or standard difficulty. It's been a while since I've done some math on this channel, so let's break out the calculator. Let's assume that Roland Banks is playing the Gathering on standard difficulty. During the first Mythos phase of the game, he draws a Rotting Remains. Roland has a base willpower skill value of 3, so he has a 37.5% chance to pass the skill test. If Roland commits Steadfast to the skill test, he has an 87.5% chance of passing the skill test. That is really good, obviously. However, it's important to remember that the skill value bonuses are subject to diminishing returns. If Roland had committed only 2 willpower skill icons to the test, he still had an 81.25% chance of passing the skill test. While the first 2 skill icons boosted his odds by a whopping 43.75%, the third skill icon boosted his odds by a paltry 6.25%. In this case, that third willpower skill icon on Steadfast is a bit of a waste. Obviously, this becomes less of a problem if you're running into encounter cards such as Visions of Future Past from the Dunwich Legacy, which requires you to commit a lot more skill icons to mitigate its effects, or you're playing on harder expert difficulty where there's a lot more variance in the chaos bag. It's hard to argue against a skill that starts a scenario with 3 willpower or 3 combat skill icons. We already know that there's going to be a lot of encounter cards with negative skill modifiers in the Circle Undone, so playing Steadfast will definitely give you a leg up if you run into locations with haunted abilities, racked, or whippoorwills. Playing skills such as Steadfast also let you tinker with the ratio of assets, events, and skills in your deck. You may commit Steadfast to willpower or combat skill tests, so you may want to consider replacing Guts and or Overpower with it, freeing up some valuable deck slots in the process. Steadfast is making the cut in a lot of decks over at Arkham DB at the moment, and it's a great tool to have at your disposal as the skill tests become more challenging to pass consistently. That's going to do it for my review of the Guardian cards in the Circle Undone. There's a lot to like about the Guardian cards in this box. I think Delay the Inevitable and Steadfast are both quite good. They aren't radical departures from cards we already know and love, but they do change things up just enough to give players some food for thought when they sit down to build a deck. Interrogate also has potential, however, I'm a little bit worried that it's saddled with too many conditions to see widespread play. It's also a little bit expensive to play without that resource discount that Joe Diamond gets. Of course, if you can, Joe Diamond can play it for free, but if he's got to draw it at just the right time, which is a strike against it in my book. Overall, a great way to start the set, this box, and I'm looking forward to seeing what else this box has to offer. That's going to do it for this episode. If you enjoyed what you hear, remember to like, comment, and subscribe. If you need to contact me, I can be reached at manfromleng@gmail.com. I'm also on Twitter at manfromleng. Until the stars are right, keep your shotgun close and your elder sign closer. Take care out there, and happy investigating.